You're listening to KSG Podcast. This is a short, crisp, concise, exam-oriented editorial for civil services aspirants. In this podcast, we are going to talk about Ukraine's revolutions. Source for the content is Meera Patel's article for the Indian Express. Since 1990, Ukraine has had one revolution every decade. As Russian forces continue their long march into the former Soviet state, we talk about some of these revolutions and their outcome. We start with the Granite Revolution. Ukraine's first and perhaps least known popular uprising was the Granite Revolution, which took place in October 1990. At the time, Ukraine was still a part of the Soviet Union. However, the communist bloc was a waning power, and under Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev, also a relatively more tolerant one. Despite progress under Gorbachev, the stain of the Cold War ran deep, and the citizens of Ukraine were clamoring for change. The revolution was led by a group of students who set up tents along the granite tiles that lined Kiev's Independence Square, thus giving the movement the moniker by which it is known today. Having set up dozens of tents, students referred to their tent camp as the territory free of communism. Flags and posters were scattered across the square, with one declaring, "It is better to die than to live in the Soviet Union." Soviet-era officials remained in power, and crucially, a giant Soviet hammer and sickle continued to loom over Independence Square until 2003, when it was removed in the months preceding Ukraine's second revolution in as many decades. Another revolution is the Orange Revolution. The Orange Revolution was a series of protests and political events that took place in Ukraine between November 2004 and January 2005. The protests were prompted by several reports from foreign and domestic election monitors alleging that the country's 2004 presidential elections runoff was rigged. The two men at the center of the controversy were then Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych, who was backed by the Kremlin, and Viktor Yushchenko, an ally of the West. The Election Commission had declared Yanukovych as the winner despite strong condemnation from America and the EU, which considered the election to be illegitimate. Russia, on the other hand, claimed that it had seen no evidence of election fraud. Putin saw the changes afoot in Ukraine and more than anything feared that similar movements would take place in Russia. His focus thereafter was to crack down on the rights of speech and association. Ukraine, however, remained ostensibly democratic and increasingly independent from Moscow, with its third revolution coming nearly a decade after the second revolution. Now, this revolution was the Maidan Revolution. Like its past two revolutions, the Euro-Maidan protests were born out of a tug-of-war between Russia and the West over Ukraine. In 2010, Yanukovych defeated Yushchenko and assumed the position of prime minister. After coveting NATO partnership under Yushchenko, under Yanukovych, the pendulum of Ukrainian allyship swung back towards Russia. In late November of 2013, the government in Kiev announced that it would suspend plans to sign an association union with the EU, choosing instead to form closer ties with Moscow. Protesters once again flocked to Independence Square, but unlike the previous revolutions, which had been entirely bloodless, the Maidan Revolution was to end in tragedy. 3 months after protests began, security forces mounted attacks against demonstrators, eventually killing approximately 100 of them in the process. Later in February 2014, the French, German, and Polish foreign ministers arrived in Kiev to try and broker a settlement between Yanukovych and the opposition. However, immediately after signing the agreement, Yanukovych fled the country over fears for his own safety. Those fears were not unfounded. Protesters saw Yanukovych as a Russian puppet, and although he maintained strong support in eastern Ukraine, he could not shake off allegations that the assault on protesters was demanded by the Kremlin in exchange for a $15 billion bailout package. Several government ministers from across Europe blamed Russia for exacerbating the violence, but Putin remained defiant. Meanwhile, Ukraine has increased military cooperation with NATO and spent billions on fixing its armed forces so that it may one day join the alliance. Trade with Russia has also declined, with supply chains rerouted through Europe. An economy that is not wholly dependent on Russia, along with better military capabilities and closer relations with NATO, will be crucial advantages for Ukraine in the months to come. Most significantly, the attitudes of Ukrainians have changed considerably since the revolution. Polls after polls indicate that Ukrainians are more patriotic than ever before and increasingly apprehensive and hostile towards Moscow. A recent Kiev Institute of Sociology poll found that over 50% of Ukrainians would resist Russian aggression either by taking up arms or by participating in civil disobedience. Prior to 2014, those numbers would have been considered optimistic folly. That's it for this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. To join KSG India courses and to crack the IELTS exam, visit ksgindia.com. You can also get a PDF of this podcast on ksgindia.com.